Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing an updated fundamentals tier list. So basically which fundamentals should you be working on first and kind of how much effort you should put into each one. I'll do my best to timestamp everything in the description below so you can go through and skip through the ones you're most interested in, or you can just skip to the end. The reason I'm doing this is because at the beginning of last year, I think this is around March last year, I made a fundamentals tier list and I went back and looked at it, and I think that my opinions on a few things have changed, and also I think the game itself has changed a little bit in terms of what is most valuable. So I just wanted to give you guys a quick update on that. So we'll waste no time and get started. And the very first thing I'm going to put on here that hasn't changed is farming. So farming is probably the most important fundamental in the game. So farming kind of comprises a few different things, right? It's obviously the actual last hitting, but it can also be, making sure you're there on the waves. It can be, kind of a little bit of like side laning and stuff as well. Basically just everything to do with getting CS. And I think that is, it's the same thing as like in an FPS, how like aim is just the most important thing, or at least one of those fundamental pillars that is going to take you further in the game. Farming, I mean, it's no surprise really, right? If you just have more stuff, you're going to win more. Something I will say about this though is that like a lot of the time when I'm coaching people and I see that they have low CS and stuff, I actually think it's like kind of uncommon these days that people are really bad at just like last hitting creeps. Most of the time when I'm coaching someone and I see that their farming is kind of poor, it's one of a few things, which is that either they don't prep the waves very well, so like at a certain point, you kind of don't have to really last hit the creeps anymore if you prep them properly. So an example would be, when you get to kind of like level 8, level 9 as Ari, you can, just like order the backline once and you can one-shot it with your Q, or you might even, depending on your AP, be able to one-shot it with Q. And there's lots of like different ways to prep waves. So like LeBlanc's another one where you generally order the backline once, you order one of the melees to 50% HP, you Q another melee, and then you W it all, and that gets you about 5 out of 6 of the wave. So that's where a lot of the missed CS comes from, is people just like, not, or I guess reaching the point where they can just one-shot the wave and shouldn't actually have to contest it, but they lose it anyway. And the other way that people tend to lose farm is by mismanaging their side lane, which I'll have a look at, and also just like not prioritizing waves that or as much as they should. Like it's very important in League in general that you pretty much always push the wave, whether this is in mid game or early game, before you make a play. And that sort of rule will take you to the highest level. There are, some exceptions to that, right? Like if there's a fight happening right next to you, you probably should run to it. But in general, that rule of, again, push before making the play is a rule for a reason, and it's going to help your farming a lot. To build on that, I want to put side laning in S tier. Now, obviously, if you main like AD carry or something and you're not going to be doing a whole lot of side laning, then that doesn't really matter. But especially for the solo lanes, I think side laning has become more important than ever. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first big one is that they made tier 2 towers worth a lot more gold. So now if your opponent mismanages the side lane and you manage to take a tier 2 tower from them, that's super, super valuable. I also think that because they made jungle camps more difficult to farm, it's pretty much impossible to farm a jungle camp unless like you're really good at side laning, or you are naturally ahead from like your laning phase, or maybe you took a lot of side lane gold and again that gave you a lead which allowed you to farm camps. Before, there was kind of like basically any champ could farm side lane camps as long as they weren't too far behind. But now it's like if you're side laning well, you kind of have access to this extra income of being able to do grumps and krugs. Whereas if you're behind or you're not side laning well, you won't have the time, and also you just won't have the damage to actually do the camps. So someone that is winning side lane, again, gets access to jungle camps, whereas the person who's losing does not, and like you potentially get access to taking tier 2 turrets and stuff as well. So being able to side lane goes a really long way, especially again if you are a mid or a top laner. And obviously this is a little champ dependent, right? Like how a champ side lanes is going to be different, right? Like some champs want to, again, push and hit turret, whereas some champs want to push and move, right? There's different things you can do. But overall, I think side laning has become more and more valuable, and is definitely something worth investing time into if you haven't watched my guides on side laning or mid game already. Next, I want to get a few of these champion ones out of the way. So the first one would be champion knowledge. And I think, champion knowledge is always something that's very important, right? Like obviously knowing how to play your champ goes a really long way. I will say that I think the actual fundamentals, the bigger ones up here do matter more, right? Like even if you have really good champion knowledge, if you can't farm, for example, like that's obviously not going to help you, right? But I think that, just champion knowledge alone goes a really long way, and it is a really important fundamental. This can obviously depend a little bit, how difficult the champ you're playing is, because some champs, right, if you don't have good champion knowledge, you're only be, say, getting 50% of the champion's output, whereas some champions that are more, simple or just have easier mechanics or whatever, if you have maybe decent champion knowledge, you might be getting 90 to 95% of that champion's output. So champion knowledge, as always, is pretty important, but I do think it's a little less important than some of the huge ones up here. Another one on this list I want to put is champion pool. So I think champion pool is one that actually depends a lot on elo, and also maybe just like, I guess, like how much you value this yourself. So like, in my opinion, in lower elos, having a champion pool is not super important, right? Like you probably can easily one trick a champ. You can have a champion pool of like 1 to 3 or 4 even champs in your pool, and that is completely fine. It's not going to be too much of an issue. I do think that, if anything, for lower elo players, they should actually keep the champion pool a little bit smaller, and it's probably better to have champions that are a bit more similar to each other rather than ones that cover a bunch of different scenarios. So for example, a high elo champion pool might want to have like a lot of champs that deal with all these different scenarios you can come up with, right? And I'll give some examples in a sec, but lower elo champion pool might want to consist of maybe all mages or maybe all assassins or whatever, just because, again, you want to try and keep the game as similar as it can be so that you can focus on these other, fundamentals up here and not have to, I guess, like put a lot into not only learning a different champ, for each of your champs in your pool, but also learning a new class, right? Because if you're learning a bunch of new classes like melee, ranged, mage, assassin, fighter, etc., that's going to be a lot on your plate all at once, which is kind of bad. Now, I will say that if you're in high elo, I actually think champion pool matters more than ever before. I think these days that, and it gets worse every year, I think the meta champs are so much better than the off meta champs, specifically in those higher elos, that you really do need to have a champion pool that consists of the meta picks. I also think that it's really important in high elo, mainly because of how like AD and AP works, that you do have some balance of AD and AP champs in your pool. And also I think having mobility in your pool in a high elo is kind of important as well, because you'll get punished a lot for playing immobile champs against, heavy engage or whatever. But I honestly think for most of you watching this video, I wouldn't overthink that. And for the most part, I would just try and keep a small pool of champs that you enjoy. Champ select, I think, would be somewhere in B for me. So I think it'd probably be on the lower end of B, and I probably will move it over a little bit later. I think that, champ select it can go a long way, right? Like if you get a good winning matchup and you've countered their comp or whatever, like that can definitely make the game a lot easier for you. But I always think of these in terms of like, well, imagine if like a bronze player had like a really good champ select, but then was like really, really bad at, like playing the champ, or was like bad at farming and sidelaning or whatever. Like, is that really going to matter? And the answer is like probably not. So champ select is one of those things where like if you've got all the fundamentals above it down really well, then champ select is something you can start investing time into and thinking about. But it'd definitely be lower on the list of things for me to have a look at. I do have a video that is sort of outdated. It's called like How to Not Lose in Champ Select or something. I think that is still a pretty good video. There's maybe a couple things in it that are maybe not as applicable to this season, and I probably will make a more updated version of it. But yeah, I guess Champ Select, it's important, but maybe not as important as like the actual gameplay things itself. Next up, let's get rid of some of these laning ones. So we'll put trading, cooldowns, and wave control all into S tier. And I think that you could move these around a little bit depending on which ones you think is more valuable. I think for me, I'd probably put it something like this. I'm not sure. You could move them around. The thing is, they're quite closely linked, right? Like your wave control and trading, your cooldown and trading, those are all linked together. The main important thing here, I guess, to note is that like the laning phase itself is very important, right? Like I think that the laning phase affects a lot of the rest of the game. If you're really good in lane, it's going to make your side laning and team fighting, etc. way, way easier. And also, if you fall really far behind in lane, it's going to suck, right? That it will be harder to farm. It will be harder to side lane and stuff like that. And League is the game in general where falling behind is very, very punishing. Like you're not really meant to fall behind. I think it's okay to like go even. It's okay to even lose somewhat gracefully. But if you do like have multiple deaths in lane or whatever, like that is going to be a very, very difficult game. I think also just the early game in general, and not just laning phase, but the early game in general is a really good place to start if you're kind of stuck in a rank. Like whenever someone comes into my chat and asks something like, hey Shok, I'm Emerald 1, I'm D1, Plat 1, etc., and I'm trying to get to the next rank, like what do you recommend I work on? And the thing I always say is that like ultimately you can work on any fundamental, right? Like if you improve anything, you will climb. Especially if it's one of your weaker fundamentals. If you bring that up, it's gonna launch you forward in rank pretty quickly. But I think a easy place to look is to just focus on cleaning up your early game. So that would be stuff like your warding, your laning, again, your cooldowns, wave control, trading, etc. Just making sure those are all really solid for the first 15 minutes and just giving yourself like a very good platform, I guess, to carry games on, because it kind of means like, if you do have a game where you can just win the game through laning phase, then great. You can just win there and not worry about any of the fundamentals. But also, if it's a game that goes on a bit longer, you at least give yourself a good starting point to tackle some of those later fundamentals going into the mid and late game. Speaking of the early game, and one of the things you should definitely focus on, I think vision has become actually a lot more important with the changes that Riot has made to mid. So I'll show you an example of why that is. So it used to be that you could defend yourself mid with just a pink ward. So when you had a bush in this location in the river, you guys might remember from last season, that was enough to kind of keep yourself safe. And that meant that even if you used your trinkets somewhat poorly, as long as you had this pink ward, you would be completely safe. The thing is, this has become a lot more difficult now, mainly because you can't really place a pink here because, the enemy jungler can just make their way, I guess it's this one, enemy jungler can make their way through here and without getting spotted, right? So you can pink this, but the problem with this is that, like, a lot of the time, by the time you see this jungler on this ward, because remember, you'll be hugging to this for safety, by the time you see this jungler, you might actually be in too much danger, right? Like, the enemy mid might have pushed you towards this, and previously, you would have plenty of time to see this jungler early, and then either walk away, or trade back, or whatever, but now you don't actually have as much time. So it's really important that you have not only a pink ward, but also a yellow ward in order to defend you. Now, something you can do is if you don't have a pink ward, that you can just ward here, and that does work fine. But the thing is that you can't have 100% uptime on your trinkets because, even if you're placing them the moment they come up, they don't last as long as the cooldown. So eventually you will have some time where you need to bridge that gap with a pink ward. But the problem with that, again, is at some point, this vision isn't really giving you as much as it did before. And this is why mobile mids have become much more difficult to play in this season, is because the vision is overall weaker. So that means that playing around your vision, placing your vision correctly, making sure you're hugging and all those sort of things, it's become much more important, particularly if you play in a mobile mid. Now, there are a lot of champs these days with dashes, right, that can, end up having less vision and honestly play fine with it. So in that sense, depending on what champ you play, this could be lower, but I think for the average, mid lane champ especially, is much more important these days. For other roles, I mean, it's probably about the same. I can't really speak too much for the other roles, but I do think for mid lane that vision has become much more important. There's also a vision component in the side lane. Something that I always bring up is, like, when you do want to push the side lane, it's ideal if you can get vision of something like this. You can drop a pink in that bush and then drop a ward further up like this, and that allows you to, push this wave all the way into the tier 2. So having good vision setup, I think, just, I guess, as a side effect of side laning becoming more important, vision on side lane also has become more important. And another thing to kind of add with that is I actually think jungle tracking has become less important. So the reason for that is because nowadays jungles solo start a lot more often. So it used to be that, and I've talked about this a lot in my warning guides, and I will say this still happens a lot under D1, but I'll just explain it in case you do play in an elo where this does happen. Junglers used to always pretty much get a leash. Either, they'd leash topside, and then they would, you would see the top laner come to lane late, and that meant that you would know that the jungler was pathing bot side. And that meant that you could just easily ward. The thing is, though, these days, because junglers get leashed a lot less, they will almost always be solo starting. And the solo start location, well, it can be raptors, it can be a buff, they can start wolves, there's lots of different options, which means that these days, it's actually much more difficult to reliably track the jungler. And so you're almost better off just warding to the side that your jungler is pathing to instead. So I think in that sense that there is probably, if you do pick up on, like, the little clues that you might get, for example, if someone wards level 1 and then the enemy jungler doesn't start raptors, so they might have started somewhere on the bot side, that can give you clues. And in that sense, maybe there's higher skill to jungle tracking than before, but I honestly think it's just, like, less useful than before. And most of the time that this is actually relevant is just in the first few levels, in which case you can just ward to where your jungler is going to anyway. And then from then on, you'll generally be able to just, again, ward towards the objectives. Like if, grubs are spawning, then you probably want to ward towards grubs and play for it. So I think jungle tracking overall is a little less important than before. Some out-of-game stuff that we could quickly talk about would be runes and itemization. So I think runes are probably somewhere in the C tier. I think that for the most part, you can just copy whatever the meta runes are, and it will probably be fine. I think runes are one of those things that, like, yes, there is room for a little bit of min-maxing, and there are admittedly some matchups that change a whole lot. Like there'll be assassin matchups where if you have bone plating versus don't have it, like, that is a completely different lane. So if you are a bit confused on runes, you can go check my rune guide that I just made about a week ago. But I do think that runes in general are it's not that they're not as impactful, but there's less difference between suboptimal runes and optimal runes as there is for something like itemization. I think itemization, on the other hand, it's much more situational game to game, especially if you do play a role without as many cookie cutter builds. Like I think mid lane APs being the example of the mid lane AP itemization is extremely complicated and full of traps and stuff like that. And I made again, an AP itemization guide that you guys can go back and watch. But I think having good itemization is really important. And again, when I'm coaching people, not often do I have to bring up the runes, but almost always I have to go over itemization. So this is one of those things where it probably is just worth watching a guide on itemization and just, actually sitting through the whole thing and like really understanding it, as opposed to just like trying to wing it, because I think that it is something that is not only very punishing, right? Like if you get wrong itemization, like if you don't have, for example, like percent pen in games where they're going to have a lot of MR or whatever, or you're getting a death cap later and stuff like that, it can really, really harm you. And also it doesn't take that much investment to get at least to a decent level of itemization, even if you're not absolutely perfect at it. Summoner spells, I think I'll just put in D. I think summoner spells are, I mean, for the most part, they're just the same, right? Like ADCs basically take Flash Barrier every game, sometimes take Cleanse. Junglers take Smite, mids take Flash TP. I think tops maybe have the most variety, and that they can take Ghost sometimes, Ignite, and TP. But I think, again, for most of you watching this video, it is just going to be summoner spells and D. There really isn't much need to think about it. You can probably just copy someone and it'll be completely fine. F keys I'm going to put in D tier as well. So F keys are one of those things I think, depending on what champs you play, can be useful. Like if you're playing a champ that roams a lot, then, like looking at the other lanes and kind of predicting your roams and stuff in advance is good. So it's not so much that F keys are not important, but it's just like F keys are so much less important than just about everything on this list, especially for the amount of time you have to spend investing into them. I think the F keys are a pretty sizable undertaking and will take away from a lot of your other fundamentals until they've become a habit. And it's just not worth it until you've honestly become really good at all the rest. And I wouldn't even really bother with F keys until, I don't know, you're at least like diamond, if not higher. Like, in fact, like some famous players like Chovy, for example, like barely even use F keys. Like you'll just see him like basically lock screen on his lane the whole time. Now that is somewhat because of the champs he plays, right? Like he doesn't really have a roaming play style, nor does he really play roaming champs. But that's an example, right? I think F keys are one of the most, I don't know, least efficient skills to invest your time into. It's not to say that they're useless, and it's not to say that they're not useful. Actually, like they kind of are. But again, it's not really worth the time investment. I think I'm going to put win conditions in C tier as well. I think a lot of the time win conditions is one of those kind of phrases that gets thrown around sort of as a buzzword almost. And I think that a lot of times people hyper focus on looking at things like, oh, our team comp is a 1-3-1 comp. Like we really want to play towards this win condition, and their team's like an engage comp, etc. And again, it's not that these things are not important, right? But I think most of the time in solo queue, playing two specific win conditions is actually just like quite difficult to coordinate for a team. Now, individual win conditions, right? Like what does my champion want to do? For me, that would just be part of champion knowledge. So I see this more as like a team thing. And I also think that, even if you do play a champion that, wants to win, like let's say you play a champ like Yon, right? That really wants to, have isolated 1v1 early and then, play for 2v2s once you've got your tier 2 boots. Maybe you want to pressure the side lane a lot, make sure you're getting side prior on that. I think all these things, they still kind of come down to the same, I guess, like principles of solo queue, is that solo queue is almost always decided on like dragon fights and baron fights. And the in-between is just making yourself as strong as possible, kind of like based on what your champ is good at. So if your champ is good at farming, then in that like 5-minute period between dragons, you'll spend that time farming and trying to get gold. If your team, if your champ is good at making picks, then you'll still have to farm a little bit, but you'll probably push and then like rotate mid and stuff like that. So I guess like, again, I'm not saying that this is like not important, and the way I'm speaking about it here kind of sounds like it is important, but I think it's just, for me, that is mostly champion knowledge, and I also think that it's less specific than people think. I really do think that solo queue plays out just about the same way, almost the same time. It's just like about taking a different path to get there, but it all comes down to, again, like those 5v5s and team fights at the end of the day, and it's just like what is the best way to get fed on the way to that point. And for me, that is more champion knowledge. But there is an argument that like if you think this is if you think this is very separate from champion knowledge, and you're speaking more about like selfish win conditions as opposed to team win conditions, then maybe you could see it higher, but for me it's very separate. Next, let's do recall timers and tempos. So I'm going to put like recall timers or base timings in S tier. pretty much every time I coach someone, there are many, many issues with base timing. So this could be that they're basing too often and they're not pressuring the map enough. It could be that they're staying on the map with too much gold. It could be that they're, not basing when their team is off the map, or, not basing ahead of objectives. There's so many different things to think about with base timers, and it's a very easy thing to get wrong. And it actually does affect the game in a really, really big way. So I would highly recommend, if this is something that I think often does get forgotten about, and if it's something that you've forgotten about, I would go check my guide to, I think it's called Recalling and Base Timing or something like that. I'll try and link it in the description below. Actually, I'll just link my Fundamentals playlist and you can go through and have a look. But yes, it's extremely, extremely important. And there's lots of times where I will, again, I will look at someone's replay and they'll be kind of talking about how, like, this wasn't a good fight because I didn't play it correctly or whatever. And then it's like, well, you're just sitting on like 1500 gold, right? Or you're taking a fight where you should have reset because you only had 60% health, or you didn't have your ulti or something. So it's a lot about like minimizing your downtime and maximizing your uptime on the map. So making sure that, you can pressure as much as possible, as often as possible, while also in those like kind of windows where you can't pressure because you lack the resources, either health or cooldowns, or you have too much gold or whatever, that you spend that time in base instead. And it's also a lot about kind of syncing the tempo with your team, and that's something I need to actually make a video on, about is making a full separate guide. I think tempo and recall timers are somewhat linked together. I would say tempo is a little less important. Tempo is more like how much time you spend doing something, and I can give you examples of like kind of bad uses of tempo. So like, for example, if you spend time like hitting a turret but you don't actually get a play, that can be a poor use of tempo if you end up then recalling and missing creeps because you stayed too long hitting the turret, right? So it's a lot of those like little things. And also somewhat is about, again, like syncing the pressure with your team. So a good example would be like, let's say you really do want to recall because you have like a lot of gold, but your entire team is pressuring the map. Like, let's say that you're split pushing top or something and your team is all pressuring mid. You can't really base there even if you want to, because the pressure would be so bad, right? Like, it would be really bad because you would have to spend all this like time, all this tempo, like resetting, walking out of the base while your team is still trying to pressure. So they would have to back off. So in some senses, I think tempo and pressure kind of go hand in hand, and it's a lot about making sure that you're synchronized with your team. This matters a lot more in the mid game. I think in the early game, tempo is more just like, making sure you, again, like push waves, and then are back to the next wave on time. So a good example of this would be like, if you push a mid wave, right, you really don't want to seesaw the prior. So you can use that prior that you get from pushing to enter the river or whatever, you make your play, but you want to make sure that you're back on the wave before the enemy mid shoves it out. Because if you're there too late, the enemy mid shoves and gets prior, you have to collect the wave, and then the enemy mid makes a play. But what it should be is that if you're getting prior, you should be able to keep perma prior. So you walk in the river, you make your play, but you're back on time for the next mid wave. And that way you don't overstay your tempo and you never give the enemy an opportunity to make a play. So these are somewhat linked together in terms of just like, again, pressure and tempo and, all that sort of stuff kind of goes together. And I will make a video kind of expanding on that, but I do have a good video already on base timers, so I would check that out. Following on from that concept, we have roaming and also priority usage. So these kind of go hand in hand. Priority usage is a lot about like, what do you do after you've pushed that wave? And this can be, again, if you're a mid laner or support or whatever, some role that is going to spend a lot of time moving around the map. And roaming kind of goes with that. I'd say roaming is more like fully committing to the roam, whereas priority usage might just be like dropping a ward or whatever. Roaming is very much deciding like, am I actually going to move to the other lane? The reason these are really important is because they're very, very punishing to get wrong. So like, again, if you overstay your priority, you can potentially put yourself at risk, right? Because the enemy mid could collapse on you, or you might end up losing a wave mid or whatever. Roaming can also be a big one, where like if you roam to a lane that has a very low chance of actually working out, like they have all sums and they're very healthy, there's no CC maybe, that can be a big waste of time, and the enemy mid can just deny a wave and take a play. So it's really, really important that your priority usage in roaming is one of those things that you have at least a base understanding of, and I do have videos on both of these, and they'll probably give you a pretty solid foundation to work with. But I honestly think that, when I coach people, if their sole, like, let's say I coach someone that was like silver 1 and their sole goal was to rank up to gold 4, and they didn't actually care about improving, they just wanted some like really quick results. Maybe they wanted to get to gold 4, get the victorious skin and just quit or whatever, right? If I were coaching that person, I would actually tell them probably just like, don't roam and just don't leave your lane and just focus purely on farming. And that's not because that's the optimal play, but it's because it's much easier, again, to mess these up than it is to execute them correctly. The risk reward balance is not it's not great. Again, not to say that like roaming and stuff isn't rewarding, but if you don't know kind of what to look for, then it can end up being very punishing for you. So again, I would go check out the video, but like a TLDR would be stuff like, when you're roaming, you really want to think about like, their health, the waves, CC, where the junglers are, that sort of stuff. You don't just want to be roaming randomly, kind of like you push mid and then you just like randomly right click on another lane. That's not really a good thing to do. And priority usage, again, it's a lot like the tempo. Like it's really important that you push the wave before you make a play. But for example, a kind of checklist you can do is like, do I need to get vision? That's normally the first thing you should do with your priority, is set up vision and then allow yourself to continue to play aggressive. Also make sure that when you use your priority, again, you're back in that next mid wave. Like one I see all the time is people like get prior mid and they go and hit grubs or whatever. And that takes so long, they end up actually losing a mid wave. And that's really, really bad. Like your goals as a mid laner or a top laner or whatever is to use that prior to secure the objective, but you don't actually really want to stay there hitting it unless your wave is not there. You want to make sure you're back on that next wave, because otherwise, again, you will have to go to it and then the enemy laner will get the chance to move into the river. So be very, very careful with that. Our next little group here that I think goes hand in hand is mid-game, map awareness, and strong side, weak side. So mid-game, there's a few like kind of foundations of the mid-game, which is like, making sure that you're around every objective when it spawns, like making sure you base around a minute before dragon spawns to get there. I think also making sure you keep up your golden XP by pushing side lane turrets or by pushing waves into side lane turrets as far as you can without dying. There's other stuff like make sure you don't share your golden XP with other carries on your team, which is one that I see again every time I coach someone. I see them like grouped up with TP, standing on their AD carry or something, sharing the mid wave, and that's a really, really bad thing to do. So I think that you could somewhat say that this mid game is, a part of side laning and farming and like playing around objectives and whatever. But I think the mid game still is really, really important, and I think that again, if you go watch my guide to mid-game, you'll probably realize that there's some very low-hanging fruit that you can get out of the way just by getting some basic understanding of it. Some things that are kind of important in the mid-game are the map awareness and the strong side, weak side. And you could maybe argue that this is higher, but I think it depends a lot about it honestly depends a lot about your elo. So in high elos, having really good map awareness on the side lane and a good understanding of strong side, weak side is really, really important. So to kind of quickly give you a crash course on this, like let's say that as a mid laner, you really want to push to this tier 2 turret because you want to get the wave all the way in. This is a lot easier to do if your, let's move a few things. If your jungler is on your side and your support is laning bot and theirs are showing top side, you can basically be as aggressive here as you want just by tracking your teammates, even if you didn't have any vision, because you know that there's enough help around here and also that the enemy team cannot be here. So in that sense, the understanding of strong side, weak side, and having basic map awareness goes a super long way. That being said, like if you have good vision, you might just be able to do this regardless, right? Like even if you're somewhat poor understanding of strong side, weak side, if you have a good vision setup, so like if you pinked here and warded here, like I said before, that might allow you to push up fairly far and get away in time, even if you get collapsed on. I think that strong side, weak side is less important than map awareness though, mainly because, the strong side, weakness side thing I think mainly applies to the early game for roles like bot and top, which again, it's not super important, but it is a factor. And it applies to the side laners obviously in the mid game, but I think that the map awareness itself does apply a lot throughout the game. So again, another really common thing, and to be honest, I should probably make a video of the most common mistakes I see in coaching sessions. But another one that always comes up is that people will often take fights when their teammates are in base. So for example, like they would be looking for a fight maybe around mid with their AD carry in base. And what might be the case is that like maybe their AD carry should be here. Like maybe their AD carry shouldn't have base. Maybe dragon spawning in 30 seconds and for whatever reason, they're not here. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter why the AD carry is not here. It only matters that they're not here, right? And so in that sense, I pretty much always put down that you need to make sure you track your teammates in the mid game and pay a lot of attention to where they are when you're making plays or like going for vision or farming waves or whatever. Pretty much the entire mid game I spend staring at my minimap. Like I very rarely am actually like watching my champion. I'm mostly looking at the minimap. Just because there's so much more info that's relevant to you on the minimap than there is on your screen when you're playing the mid game. Now again, this is maybe not so important for like an AD carry or someone that's just sitting in mid the whole time, but especially for mid lane, I think it's really, really valuable. We're getting pretty close to the end now. I'm going to put team fighting up here in S tier. So again, I think team fighting ultimately decides most games of League. It comes down to, how well you execute those team fights around Dragon and Baron and generates Dragon Soul or getting a Baron that actually ends the game itself. And a lot of the rest of the game is spent making yourself stronger to make team fighting easier, right? Like if you win your lane really hard, you will probably win team fights just off your lead, even if you team fight relatively poorly. At the same time, like if you go even in your lane and you make sure to keep your farm up in the mid game, you can still carry team fights, right? Because you will have a lot of gold. Team fighting skill is probably most important when you fall behind early game or you're not as strong as you should be, because then you really need to execute team fights to a very high level to overcome the deficit that you've put yourself at. So team fighting is very important. I'm not sure if I'd argue if it's more or less important in the laning phase. I think that like, again, like farming and stuff, making sure you're strong for team fight is important. It's just whether, do you consider laning phase more important because it becomes before the team fight and makes you strong for the team fight? Or do you consider team fighting more important because even if you get fed in lane, if you team fight really badly, you might lose anyway? I'm not sure. I think you can make arguments for both. Personally, I will say that while I think laning phase is more important because that happens earlier, I do think that like if you're really bad at team fighting, that can like massively drop your win rate. And I think that even if you're a decent laner, if you're good at team fighting, you'll still probably be pretty good. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'll put team fighting here, although I will say that I am kind of making this a little unfair because team fighting, is comprised of a bunch of different things like positioning and target prior and threat assessment and all that stuff. And I haven't broken that down into categories, whereas I have done that with laning. So potentially like the individual categories of team fighting are less important, but either way, they're both really important, right? It's very, very important that you spend time reviewing your team fights, watching other people team fight, watching team fighting guides, etc. On to our final three here. I'm going to put matchups in B tier, I think. So you could maybe make an argument for matchups going higher. The thing is, I think especially when you get to very high elos, like maybe like Master GM plus, I think having good matchup knowledge does go a really long way. And actually, even though matchups I think aren't as important as like raw fundamentals themselves, I would still say that, like after you play a game, what I like to do is if I haven't played the matchup before or I don't think it went the way it should, I will go and watch the matchup on YouTube after. So let's say, for example, that I played, I don't know, Syndra versus Orianna or something, and I hadn't played that before and I didn't really know how it should go. I would go to YouTube, I'd type Syndra versus Orianna pro replays, and I'd quickly watch it, and then I'd go and kind of compare it to the lane that I just played. And you'll probably see there's a bunch of really easy things you can do to strengthen your matchup knowledge. Now, the reason I still think that that's less important is because some of what you're looking at, you might not actually be able to see without understanding the fundamentals. So for example, if you don't really know about cooldowns as a fundamental, you might not realize that the time your opponent or the time the Syndra always trades is when Orianna has no cooldowns, right? Like that could be something that you miss because you don't actually understand the fundamentals themselves. And I think a lot of the time, if you understand these laning fundamentals really well, you will more naturally be able to figure out a matchup for yourself. And also when you go and watch a matchup, you'll have a much better idea of what you're looking at, of like things they're doing with the wave, or again, how they're trading, or kind of like maybe their itemization in the laning phase and how that matters and stuff like that. So matchups are important for sure. And I think more and more important as you get high elo, but I would value just strong laning fundamentals over knowing every matchup individually. That being said, you can always just go to YouTube and you can use that to help learn, right? Like you can watch a matchup and maybe you'll actually understand some of these fundamentals better by seeing how those kind of like trading and how that wave control and stuff differs based on matchups. So yeah, they kind of go hand in hand, but I think matchups themselves are a little less important. Finally, we have mechanics and mentality, and I want to save mentality to last, so we'll talk about mechanics. And I think mechanics depend a lot on a few things. So one obviously is which lane you play, also which champs you play. So if you play, for example, a champion mid that's like very reliant on abusing its movement speed and plays into a lot of skill shot heavy champs, then it's going to be important that you have good mechanics, right? There are also champs in mid, for example, that don't require as many mechanics because their skill shots are harder to miss, or because they have less interaction. So an example would be something like Lux. There are, of course, different roles that require different mechanics. Like, I think the AD carry is quite a mechanically demanding role, whereas, like, depending on what sort of jungle champ you play, that could be very not mechanically demanding, right? So I think it's more important to look at the champs themselves rather than the role. I think every role has mechanically demanding champs, even support, which is kind of known as, like, a less mechanically demanding role, I think actually is quite mechanically intensive at the high level, and depends, of course, again, on what champs you play. I think mechanics also, there is an argument that mechanics are just S tier, right? Because like having good mechanics affects every part of the game, right? It's going to make your laning easier, your combos, your team fighting, everything. So in that sense, mechanics are absolutely S tier, right? The reason I don't want to put mechanics that high though is because I think a lot of people use mechanics as a crutch for, or as an excuse, I guess, to not be able to get better. So what they'll say is that like, oh, my mechanics are poor, so I just can't climb. Or they'll say like, you know, I'm too old and my mechanics are bad, I can't climb, etc. And it's like, you watch these people and it's like, okay, yes, maybe they don't have the best mechanics, but like, are they good at any of these things? And the answer is like, not really. Like, I think you can, like, obviously having good mechanics is a massive bonus to your climbing, right? No doubt about it. But can you reach very high rank even with very poor mechanics? I would say yes. Like, I really do think so. Like, I managed to get masters on NA on 200 ping, playing, you know, like Galio and Lissandra, champs that require less mechanics. So I think that if you're one of those people, I don't want to like shame you for it, I guess. Like, if you think maybe mechanics are bad and you don't want to climb, like, whatever. But don't use it as an excuse. The reason you can't climb is not because your mechanics are too poor. You can just get better at all these other things. And League is an average of all your skills, right? So if you're really, really good at everything on this list, but your mechanics are poor, that's fine. Your average is still going to be very, very high, and you're going to find yourself in a very, very high rank. So I don't know, like maybe mechanics should be S tier, but I almost want to, out of spite, put them a little bit lower just because people use them as an excuse when really like these things are as important, if not more so than mechanics itself. So our final fundamental is mentality, and this is always the one that I think is the hardest to rate. And the reason is because like there are plenty of players that do reach high elo with a really awful mentality, right? At the same time, there will be people that reach high elo and say that they owe it to their mentality, like their improvement process and their, you know, resistance to tilt and stuff like that. So I think ultimately for those reasons, I would probably put mentality somewhere in the middle. It's not to say that mentality is not important. And I definitely think that if you have like a good, you know, especially like an improvement process, that goes a really long way. And there are things that you can do with mentality. For example, like I think turning chat off is really good. I think taking breaks after you play a game, especially if you lose, is really, really valuable. Stuff like that can go a really long way. At the same time, I have seen a few times people that focus so much on, you know, making sure that they have like the perfect mentality and stuff like that, that they actually neglect working on gameplay concepts themselves. And that can end up stagnating you quite a lot, right? Because it doesn't matter, like, you know, having, again, super positive mental and like setting yourself up to improve really well is good. But you do have to, at some point, actually implement these things themselves. And you could, again, say that like if you have a really good mentality, then it is much easier to improve these, right? Like if you, I don't know, don't tilt much and you have a really good approach to improving and like you try and take things out of every game and etc., then I think mentality probably would be S tier, right? At the same time, like I think you can have a pretty average mentality and still climb quite a lot. So I honestly want to put it just about in the middle. And I think that somewhat it can also just depend person to person, right? There are some people that can literally just play through the tilt, right? That just play like 10 games. And even though they're super angry, like it doesn't seem to affect their play. I can tell you, I'm not one of those people. I'm someone that like, if I have a bad game or whatever, I definitely do need to take a break, or I think it will affect my gameplay in the next one. Especially if it was like a very tilting game, right? And that's something I think you need to be like very honest with yourself about, is like, you know, realizing, I guess, when you're actually tilted or what tilts you. Because like one of the big things that tilts me is people typing, right? So like I used to play with chat off basically all the time because there was nothing useful actually said in chat. But yeah, this is something I discussed quite a lot in my last one as well. And I think you really can make arguments for it being just about anywhere on the list. I think I will put it just about in the middle, kind of as like a net neutral is kind of what I mean, where it's really just going to be as valuable as you make it to be, right? Like if you do set yourself up to have a really solid mentality and then work on all these things, and that's great. At the same time, if you're just positive and don't tilt, but you don't actually work on these things, I wouldn't expect you to climb, you know? And I guess, again, on the coin flip, or the flip side of that, is that if you're very, very toxic, it probably will be a negative to you. You probably will lose more games and you probably will stagnate a lot more than before. For those sorts of people, like, yeah, it probably is good to fix your mentality. I guess what I'm saying is that, like, a little bit of investment into mentality goes a pretty long way, I think, just to making sure that you don't have those free losses to, you know, tilting or, like, rage queuing or whatever. But I think there is kind of diminishing returns in mentality, and that, I guess, is true of basically any fundamental, but where it might just be better to start investing that time into something else instead. That's going to be my fundamentals tier list all done for season 14. Let me know what you guys think in the description below. If you have any questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear them, and I will try to respond to everything. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.